Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. There's so many of you in this room at the end of this rainy afternoon here in Caen for one of the last debates following the 2 days of this forum focused. This session will be focused on the 10 years on from the Arab Spring, which happened in 2011, which were moments of protests, uprising in many different countries in the Arab world, starting with Tunisia, then Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, and others. We have a colleague with us in Beirut, Ziad Abdel Samad. Can you hear us okay? Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, I wasn't able to get in touch with you much in advance of this event, but I'm sure we'll still be able to manage this well. So Ziad Abdel Samad leads a network of a range of NGOs, and it's called the Arab NGO Network for Development. And it's a network of 30 NGOs, more or less. You can correct me if I've got that wrong. 30 NGOs from about 12 different Arab world countries. And the objective is to mobilize civil society and to build capacities in different areas in order to boost human rights on topic of solidarity and such things. So, to my right, I have Ambassador Ghazi Gerari, who is the ambassador for Tunisia for UNESCO at the moment, and was involved in the implementation of new structures in Tunisia following the 2011 revolution. And then we have Professor Jean-Pierre Filieu here with me, who's a professor, who's an expert on the Arab world. He works at Sciences Po School in Paris, University in Paris, and he's written around 10 books on this topic. And his last book takes an interesting approach, looking at secular aspects of the Arab world. Our discussion is going to be quite open. For the first hour, we'll be talking as members of this panel, and then the last 30 minutes we'll open up to questions from everybody else in the room. So 10 years on from the Arab Spring. The situation 10 years on is quite disappointing, following the hope we had back then with all of these popular uprisings demanding democracy, freedom, and social justice in these countries. Ziad Abdel Samad, 10 years on, how do you see the situation? Do you want me to speak in French or in English? We prefer French. No, it's up to you. We have interpretation, people have headsets, but if you want to speak in English, but it's up to you. Well, I'll start in French, and if I start to struggle, I can speak in English maybe instead. First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here at the forum and to talk about a topic which is complex, but also very interesting. I don't know why it's so disappointing. Yes, we've not been able to meet our objectives fully, But if we try to be objective about it, despite the complications, despite the dangerous situation right now, I think that 10 years ago, the peoples of these countries decided to overcome their fears and to try and affirm their rights. We have a right to freedom, a right to dignity, a right to social justice. So, what I wanted to say is that these revolutions were not of a traditional form. They didn't follow the norms of traditional revolutions, which are normally led by a political movement with a clear vision and the program and ready-made alternatives to the system. In our region, we are used to seeing lots of coups led by the military, but this time it was the people, it was direct democracy being demanded by the people. Sometimes people criticize the fact that these popular movements didn't get started, didn't start out because they had a political movement, but it was just something really spontaneous. Spontaneous uprising against the totalitarian system, against the dictator, and against all forms of oppression. So it was not a traditional form of revolution. This revolution had to take time to build up its own form of leadership, and it's still ongoing, and it's a major challenge. The lack of leadership, in fact, was an opportunity in that it provided greater flexibility. It helped to ensure the reach, widen the reach of the popular movement, but also the lack of a political structure also opened the door to others, opened the door to political structures that were already ready, traditional, long-standing political parties, as well as radical movements and political movements who were allies of the former regime. So they were able to become a part of all of this, and this maybe led to a loss of motivation and led to a slowdown in the process. So now, 10 years on, we can see that the Arab Spring is not yet complete. We would have liked to have had more satisfactory results, but 10 years on, we're moving on to a second phase. There was the second phase in countries such as Lebanon, Iraq, etc. We've seen the second phase, and we've seen that some of the lessons learned were applied, especially in Sudan and in Algeria. So I would say that during the first wave of the Arab Spring, the popular movements were encouraged to organize elections because people thought that elections were the only way to build democracy, but they were not ready. So the results of these elections were disappointing. And then with the second wave, we'd learned that elections are not the ideal way to do things. And we saw in Sudan, for example, that the popular movement slowed down this process, asking for a transitional period to get ready for elections. So it's a bit of a change in terms of the strategies used here in the second wave. And this gives us a bit of hope for the future.
Je crois que là, oui, si vous me donnez un peu une minute pour dire
Could you just give me
qu'il
one more
faut
minute
aussi
to
prendre en
conclude?
considération les facteurs extérieurs qui ont
If you take into
justement,
account
bien sûr,
external factors, this played a
comme
role,
on
of
dit,
course.
un mouvement spontané, on ne prend pas en considération tous les éléments qui sont pour
Spontaneous
et contre.
movements
Mais les
don't
facteurs
draw up a
extérieurs
list
ont
of
joué un
pros and
rôle
cons, but
uniquement
external
en
factors
faveur des changements
did not
démocratiques,
favour these changes,
des
did not
facteurs
favour the popular movement. Regional
économiques ne voulaient
stakeholders,
pas
for
un
example,
changement
were
démocratique,
afraid of the democratic
intervenaient
change and they
afin de
intervened
stopper
to try and slow down this process, to stop this process,
financement ou bien par une
either
intervention militaire
with funding
directe.
or with
Alors que
direct military intervention.
les acteurs extérieurs qui étaient censés de soutenir, de
External
financer
stakeholders
le changement étaient un
who
peu
we
hésitants
thought would
et
be
reniaient un peu
in favor of the change actually hesitated and were afraid of a lack of stability, lack of political stability,
économique. Donc,
and above
ils
all,
ont décidé
economic
de
stability.
reculer au lieu de pousser pour un changement
So
profond.
instead of pushing for
Je pense qu'il
change,
y a un certain
they
nombre
hesitated.
des éléments qui étaient
So
en
there were
faveur,
other
des éléments
factors, external factors,
qu'on doit
that were against these
analyser
popular
avec une
movements.
autre
There were some
perspective. Donc, bien
factors in
sûr,
favor, of course.
devant
So we need to
être
analyze all of this.
positive, mais je crois
And maybe this is the reason why the situation is not very
que le
positive
processus
today. But
continuera
I think the
et
process is still
nous
continuing.
ne pouvons pas continuer à vivre dans une oppression
People
sans
will
dignité
not accept
et
continue
de
living
droits humains.
under oppression without dignity and no human rights and social justice.
Maître Benjamin,
Thank you very much,
pour continuer un petit peu sur
Jean-Pierre. To
cette
continue
observation
now
du mouvement,
with this introduction to this moment,
ces mouvements spontanés, est-ce qu'ils descendent
these
massivement dans les rues
spontaneous movements and
de revendication
mass mobilization in the streets, no matter the demand,
changer les choses?
is it enough to change things, to instill
Au-delà du mandat,
sustainable change beyond the Arab world? Could be in Belarus, Burma.
Alors d'abord,
What do
merci
you think?
beaucoup. Merci à vous toutes, à vous tous. C'est toujours un
Thank you very much.
plaisir
Thank you
d'entendre
very
les
much
avis, les
to
odeurs,
all of you
les
for being here. I'm
odeurs
delighted to be here.
de reprise.
I'm always delighted to be back here in Caen.
Encore,
I've been involved in a salon
un peu plus
twice here,
visiblement,
talking about topics related to the Arab world. Sometimes it seems like quite depressing topics, but we've got a full room here, so I'm reassured.
la notion même de printemps arabe.
So,
Personnel,
for me, I doubt the fact of calling this an Arab Spring.
mouvement démocratique,
I never used the word spring. I called it a popular uprising, a revolutionary wave.
au début,
The term Arab Spring at the beginning was a nice word to use
une vague
at the beginning
qui allait
because people thought it was maybe a seasonal thing that was going to fade away. But
ils sont descendus dans la rue,
they came out into the streets, as you said, and they wanted to change things. And people thought maybe then they would move on to something else. That the break would be over after the spring, but it's actually a structural crisis, it's a long-term change. And as our friend from Beirut said, this is ongoing. So
on va se réveiller dans le statu quo. Nulle part dans le monde arabe, il n'y a
nowhere in the Arab world have we seen things go back to the status quo yet.
maintien à flot
Everywhere,
nécessite des ressources
the authoritarian regimes need a huge amount of resources to stay in power, financial and military resources.
des pays et des sociétés, tous les vagues de
Thus, the waves of refugees because of destruction of societies.
maintenir le régime d'oppression,
So to keep these oppressive regimes in power,
de dépenser
every time
considérable
they're using more and more resources,
aux droits les plus élémentaires.
and this is leading to further denial of rights.
Deux vagues qu'a mentionné
My colleague talked about two waves. I would talk about a third wave as well.
en fait, pourquoi cette crise est-elle structurelle?
So why was this a structural crisis?
1971, un demi-siècle d'indépendance des pays arabes.
from 1922 to 1971, there's a 50 years of independence. It started with Egypt, the UAE, there's Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman. And now we see how these states with no people have a huge role in the future of the region. But there was military coups from 1944 to 1969 with Syria, and there's also Libya. And then in the late 80s, there's another wave. It started in Sudan, moved on to Algeria, and this is in the context of very low oil prices, which fragilized these regimes. And this continued in Iraq. But in Iraq, the Iraqi people rose up. They were abandoned by the Americans. They left Saddam Hussein to massacre them. And in Sudan, there was the launch of the General Bashir terrible regime. So the pre-dictatorship past came back to the fore. It's interesting to see how Syrians, Libyans are bringing out their pre-dictatorship flags, the 3-star flags. It's really interesting, and this was in a context of then high oil prices, where this allowed counter-revolutionary forces to deploy a wide range of resources to strangle the uprisings. And we saw in Tunisia that it was difficult to go through the transition. We have one of the key people of this transition here with us, but it took time. You can't just implement institutions overnight, and people did everything they could to try and prevent these institutions from being formed. When I was in Syria in 2013, why did Bashar al-Assad continue in such a way? Because he didn't want an alternative to his barbarous regime, because if there was alternatives to his barbarous regime, people could see that you could do without him. People would see that there was no need to keep him in power. People said that to keep him in power in order to have a strong power against chaos, but he was chaos. This was not true. And in 2019, we have a third wave starting again in Sudan, overcoming a regime which committed genocide, and it's continued in Iraq, in Lebanon, and it's counter-revolution, but above all, pandemic now, and mass movements are unable to last with such intensity when there were all of the restrictions linked to COVID. So this was something that was completely unprecedented, unexpected, and it was a blessing for all of the dictators in the Arab world. And instead, and it's an explanation for the world of today, really. But this is a structural crisis. These regimes cannot continue. So we need real democratic transitions now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We have gone back through history. So interesting, Mr. Gazi Guerreri. You have also witnessed. We have talked about Arab Springs. We have talked about the Egyptian dictatorship, the civil war in Libya, in Syria. Tunisia is, we had hoped, was an exception. That is where it started. It was the cradle of the uprisings movement. It was, we can say, the last candlelight. Over the last few months, however, we see could it be a delayed failure of the uprising movement, of the transition? What can you tell us? Thank you so much. Thank you. To start with, I would like to thank the organizers for allowing us to use this time to talk with such a wide audience. Thank you so much. If I may, of course, I will answer your question, but first I have a question also about the question bringing us together, Arab Springs. The Arab Springs, have they failed? Or, if I may, give it this title, Lessons Learned, the Way Forward. So I think there is a little question I ask. What is the meaning of the wording itself? Who is calling it the Arab Springs? It is not the people who were protesting. It is the media, actually, English, Anglo-Saxon media, English-speaking, and then Western media more generally. It sounds, I think, good. It sounds good. It sounds appealing. It sounds slightly romantic, perhaps optimistic even. Arab Spring. And I remember speaking at a US university in 2012. We talked about the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia. It became the Arab Spring. And I think I felt a pressing need to label phenomenon because of what we already know, against what we already know. It's sending us back to the beginning of the 19th century with the Prague Spring, People's Spring. I think this is extremely misleading. In the Arab world, we are considered as being one people's, the Arab world, but we are so different. I mean, of course, it started in 2010, the movement, actually. I don't mean to correct anybody here, but it started in 2010, not 2011. And of course, the social media, TV allowed different citizens in the Arab world to see what is happening in Tunisia, and that sparked that desire to do the same. But the sociological reality, the structure of the regimes in Arab countries are so different. And for this reason, the outcomes are different in different countries. Reaction of the regimes were different. That's why I am saying we cannot talk about the Arab Spring. It was not spring. It was nothing to do with spring. And it is still ongoing, actually. That is why I'm talking not about the past here, but I think it is the last region in the world reluctant to building actual citizenship, citizens. What I mean by that is a society where citizens are the starting point in attributing power or removing power from a person, the devolution of power. So the idea of the uprising, we talked about Ben Ali's time, 23 years, to end it. Not really. That was not really the reality. The idea was to shake this monolithic foundation of power. I agree, Mr. Ziad Abdel Samad. There was no actual leadership, no actual ideology. The point was to shake this well-anchored system, these systems with their resources. I think the expectation was wrong, not the phenomenon. I think the expectation was we could snap our fingers and we would change the regime, we would organize elections, and here we are. We would have a democratic election. Citizens would be able to play their own role, could express their opinion, could express their view, could change public view. It is in progress. If we have seen these type of changes in other regions in the world, changes seeking to overthrow a whole political system, that is a long process. So I don't know whether there was this urgency to label it, to label Arab Spring or label the phenomenon. I think we need to keep this in mind. Second comment to start this debate. as you asked me about my country. I also published in an article, I rejected the concept of Tunisian model because we are talking about social science and methodology here. According to social science and methodology, the cycle should be complete and should produce stable and verifiable results for us to be able to call a phenomenon a model, Tunisian model. We talked about Tunisian model when Tunisia had just barely started the process, but we can talk about the singularity of Tunisia. It would be complicated for me to expose how singular Tunisia's situation is because we don't have much time. But of course, Tunisia is an unicum, a unique specimen, a unique phenomenon because of the heterogeneity, because the different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, the state tradition, the state domination when land had to be given up upon request over centuries and centuries. State apparatus has governed, dominated society. It goes way back, except since the early 19th century. There was civilian tradition, civilian inspiration because of enlightenment coming from the West. And we were the first country with a constitution in 1861, inspired by enlightenment. And that is why we had the first unions, workers' unions, political parties, human rights charter. Up until 3 days ago, the first woman head of government. But not the first democracy is the question. I am getting there. We were in a building construction process, but democracy is not something we can just say exists from one day to the next. I think democracy is something everybody has to own, the voter and the political party and the politician. We cannot have a democracy without democrats. We need to learn. Institutions need to learn. Mindsets have to change. So people start thinking democratically. Unless we think democracy is being allowed to vote, I don't think it is that simple. I think Tunisia is still undergoing the breakthrough moment, the revolutionary process. But it takes time, and there are a lot of positive outcomes in the process. For example, admitting that no leader today, from local level to head of state, I think nobody says we need these officials to be elected democratically. Of course, this is not being questioned. And of course, we can question it and we can discuss it. But I think we need to think in the long time. That way, we're not disappointed so soon. I am not saying that one day we won't be disappointed, but we shouldn't think possibly of disappointment so soon, so early, before the process is over. And I would like to just remind everyone that the equation for freedom is in every Arab country. The idea of elections, even not fully free and fair elections, but the idea of elections is in every country. So even any leader who is seeking to govern in the way that they used to govern in the past, they do have to work differently. So whether we call it revolution, whether we call it spring, whichever word we use, we have to be accountable. We have to think we are players, we are witnesses, but let us not simplify it all with a label, whether it is an optimistic or pessimistic label. Thank you. Yes, we will talk about the progress made through the uprising. I wanted to get back to you, Ziad Abdel Samad, at the end of your first short presentation today. You mentioned the counter-revolutions. We could call the other uprisings the counter-revolutions, mobilizing forces, internal and external forces, to fight against. But who fears democracy? Why do we fear democracy in Arab countries?
Tout d'abord, il faut prendre en considération que dans chaque pays
We have to take into account the fact that in every Arab country
d'évolution, les aspirations
there are
parce que dans chaque pays,
aspirations, wishes for change, because of the challenges to human rights, because of oppression in each country. But the situations are varied, of course. And I wanted to take into account all these different elements to answer your question. First, the role of armed forces. Tunisian armed forces do not behave like Egyptian armed forces, and they do not behave like Syrian armed forces. In a normal country, the army, the armed forces, protect the constitution. But in our countries, the army protects a dictator, the regime. In the Tunisian revolution, the army took a step back. They did not intervene. They even pushed the president to resign. The Egyptian army, on the other hand, was very active, because in Egypt, the army is not an entity there protecting the constitution. It is actually an active entity playing a role in Egypt's economic life. In Sudan, however, the army's role has been different, very different. The Tunisian army now is playing a role in the transition with civil society. It is a unique, very interesting situation, which can be seen as dangerous, but very interesting to observe. Same thing in Syria. In Syria, the army was defending against people's movements, was protecting the dictator and the system against the uprising, against the people's movement. So one of the key elements is the role of this institution, the armed forces, the armies in the Arab world. Because since 1948 and even before, the army was becoming more and more significant because of the military power, the ally of the regime. And we have talked about the homogeneity of society. We have such diversity, so the social fabric is fragile, is vulnerable. We see that in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in the Eastern Mediterranean countries. Demography, heterogeneity in demography is very important, is a significant element, a determining factor even, I would say, adding to the challenge when there is no democracy. And I was just going to add something to the question on external factors. In the region, in the neighboring region, many countries fear democracy. I agree. Monarchies, republics, they fear democracy. They're afraid of democracy because there is an anti-democratic regime, and if democracy was rising, democracy was emerging in the country, that these governments would be overthrown. So that is the reason we have seen in countries such as Russia, Turkey, Syria, of course, the army intervening. But in other countries where neighboring countries are promoting democracy, we can see it is posing a challenge. These decisions are difficult to make. They are dangerous decisions, but in order to spark change, often we have to take risks, risks which have not been taken. We can see now negotiations, talks taking place with regimes to try to find a middle ground, a suitable solution with regimes that actually were perpetrating genocide against their own people. So, if we are looking in the balance, the pros or the cons, the current situation in a lot of these countries do not encourage for this positive change.
venant justement, vous l'avez très rapidement tout à l'heure,
Jean-Pierre Filiu,
finalement qui n'a pas à craindre la démocratie.
can you tell us about the countries which should not be afraid of democracy, should not fear democracy? I'm thinking about countries, Gulf countries, for example. Why fight against an openness, said opening to democracy in these countries?
3 years ago in Caen, I was presenting my story of history of this counter-revolution. It was the title was Gangsters and Jihadists. The generals that fight against these jihadists are actually gangsters and are putting their countries at risk. The cherry on the cake is these states without people in the Gulf that play around with other countries to push their interests to the fore. I think the people that hold the power in the Gulf there's very few of them. They fit in this room, but they have huge amounts of power. But unfortunately, people see them as pioneers in terms of modernity. What about Dubai and Nabila and influencers online? Qatar brought Lionel Messi to PSG. That's a modern country. But behind all of this, there are structures which are not archaic, but they're completely from another time in a region where we will not be able to build anything sustainable unless the people, men and women, see their rights as being defended in the system. And the ambassador mentioned this just now, that that is difficult, but we should stop really oppressing them. In Iran, for example, they need to support the theocracy to stop alternatives from coming to the fore, and this is why there's such competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they both agree on trying to stop the alternative of democracy coming to the fore. We've seen Russia playing this war in Syria. And why were they able to do this? Because the war for poor people was led by Russia, whereas the rich person's war was being led against Islamic State. So how did the jihadists get access to all of their weapons? They didn't get these weapons by chance. I'm not somebody who believes in complots, but they were able to get access to these weapons from past conflicts. So Russians did the war for the poor, and then in 2015 they saved the Bashar al-Assad regime, and in 2015 they had an opening in all of the Middle East because regimes thought, great, we've got these soldiers who will help regimes, but the Russians in Syria were worn out, and in Libya, all you needed was some sophisticated drones to knock out the mercenaries that were in the country. But the real problem are our Western democracies, because faced with these men and women who were asking in their languages, different languages, for the same things that the Russians were asking for after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the same thing that the Russians were asking for following the collapse of the USSR. But did we really consider them? Did we really think that what was happening in their countries was important for our future? And how did we pay for this lack of foresight on the behalf of our leaders? Well, we had 2015 with the wave of refugees and the terrorism crisis. We cannot just believe that if we just leave things to rot, it will stay in the region. And I'm currently very concerned by Middle Eastization in North Africa, where we see the predators that we've already talked about coming to the fore in this region and to export their tensions and their contradiction to this region as well. So there's really a lack of understanding. There was an important crossroads in 2013 when Barack Obama refused to respect his commitment to punish the Syrian regime when they use chemical weapons. François Hollande, to his honor, was coherent and respected our values. When somebody commits a crime against humanity, they are our enemy. And then what did Barack Obama say to justify this? Because he has a lot of pride, even though he's very, very cool. And so what did he say after this? He said, well, in Syria, an army of peasants, of doctors and teachers could not overthrow the regime. But Mr. Obama, who freed the United States from British colonialism, an army of peasants, teachers and doctors. But even for the great Barack Obama, that was our story, and the history of the Arab world is different, and this is what we need to stop. Their fundamental aspirations are the same as ours. Maybe the way they express themselves is a bit different. They have a different language, different culture, so we need to try and understand them, to understand that a key part of our future as French people and Europeans is in the hands of the Arab world, will depend on the Arab world. Mr. Gray would support, aid, or better understanding, as Jean-Pierre Filiu was asking for. In what form would this take? Who would this come from? What would you need in Tunisia? I'm asking about Tunisia, but you could talk about the rest of the Arab world as well if you'd like. I don't want to talk about things in the past because it's still something we need in the present. Unless you would accept to say that the door opened in this part of the world and now the door has closed. Well, I'm from this region, and I think there is sufficient opportunity, as my colleague said just now, so that dignity, participation, and having a nation that we share This is possible, but we need to move from being a subject to become true citizens. So I might bypass your question and look at things in a different way.
Par rapport à des situations très différentes. Alors, bien entendu, il me semble que la première
So
c'est de comprendre.
what we need to do first of all is to understand. Try and understand before we try and do anything. So understanding comes back to what I said just now, that people didn't try to understand. Because when people talk about states, it all depends on geopolitical balance, it all depends on interests. So people support something because they don't necessarily believe in its values, but because it suits them. And we see that countries support situations in other countries in the world, not just in the Arab world, and they do not support comparable situations in other regions, in other countries. So it all really depends on your interest. So what do we need to bring democracy into this region? Well, you need the support of the international community. There was an American mobilization following the Second World War. The Americans launched the Marshall Plan. That was a great example of aid where we were able to instill democracy in certain countries, because you need socio-economic stability, because if not, the extremes take over, radicality takes over. So clearly this needs to be done. And the economic European community then supported other countries in Europe, such as Spain, Portugal, and Greece, to help them during this period. And then they also helped Eastern European countries following the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So we need this type of support. So if we share values, then we should implement this. These values should be universal. Another aspect, I believe, is to believe in equality between all peoples, no matter the colour of our skin or the colour of our passport. We cannot believe that we have truly democratic values when we have merchandise which is moving, capital which is moving, but not human beings, not all human beings. So if we want real equality, real solidarity, this is what we need. For me, for my country, Tunisia, I always say that we need to be understood before we are given support, so people understand what is at stake in the country. Does a stable country, democratic country, is that not the best response to phenomena such as the phenomena we're seeing today in our region? Issues coming from countries in sub-Saharan Africa, people who are traveling from sub-Saharan Africa trying to reach Europe. Wouldn't the spreading of democracy in the region be the best stabilizing measure to stop this type of issue? So I think first of all we need to be coherent, and we should launch policies that are coherent with these values. Secondly,
semble que c'est nécessaire
when they're pioneers,
en soutien aux plus avancés et aux
we need to support these pioneering countries or peoples
et après,
to show the example, show the way for other countries. And then
ce n'est pas un rêve,
people understand it's not impossible, it's not a dream, it's actually possible. So to come back what I said just now, this is how the slogan of the people want the regime to fall came to the fore, because some people saw on television that this had an impact. Even if the social societal situation was different back then, I'm not calling for aid, I'm not calling for resources. I'm just asking people to be coherent. If people believe in democracy and people believe in democracy as a stabilizing factor internationally, then you cannot launch policies which go against this. Thank you very much.
Je vais revenir, bon, on va passer un petit peu ouvrir
We are shortly going to be
tous les trois d'accord sur le fait que
moving on to look a little bit more about hope. You're talking about how this is a process, how this is a movement which will be able to bounce back. And I think the person who's probably best placed to observe what's going on, to observe the dynamism and creativity in civil society in the Arabic world, would be Ziad Abdel Samad, because he's part of a network of NGOs who are very active in this part of the world. So could you quickly say something about the hope that you see? Is there a lot of hope with all the people you work with, the different organizations from civil society? Yes, there's conditional hope. We can be optimistic, but we have to take into account certain conditions. I think people are very motivated. People want change. People have started demanding for dignity. They started demanding access to their rights, and now they want to continue with this, to stick with this till the end, to have a country which respects democracy, citizenship, and has this rule of law. But we also need to take into account other factors. Economic and political change. You can't talk about political change unless you have access to social justice. You can't talk about economic change unless you've got a change in governance. So it needs to be a really complete change. And when I talk about political change, we need a strengthening of citizenship. We need people to be really involved, to participate. But the most important thing is that we need to take into account the socio-economic situation in the region. The majority of the problems, the majority of political instability is the result of a lack of social justice. We are in a region where wealth is in the hands of very few. Poverty has been on the rise. Unemployment has been on the rise. We have many problems. And this is not just something temporary, it's something systemic. We need to rethink the economic system, we need to rethink our socio-economic strategies, and we need to launch a new socio-economic system which takes into account these concerns about employment, redistribution of wealth, to make things fairer. And we also need a system for social protections. This is something that we do not have right now. So if we have a very complete agenda, and we know how to do this, then we will be able to be optimistic. But I'd now like to talk to you quickly about some external factors. I don't think I could talk better than our diplomat colleague because he speaks very well. But I would say that destabilization of the region will always have an impact on neighboring countries. So we all need to try and ensure that we have stability.
Depuis, disons, le projet du partenariat jusqu'au moment, l'Europe tend à compromettre, à faire des compromis sur les valeurs que l'Europe a été construite
So
sur.
in the last 10 years, Europe has values of human rights, democracy, and now it's compromising these values. Article 2 has never been respected, and Europe has never reacted to ensure that this article is respected. So now, I cannot understand how Europe continues to support regimes who are committing genocides, human rights violations, that they negotiate with such regimes. Why are they doing this? Is this for stability in the region or because of investments in terms of natural resources? But no matter the reasons, would we be able to come up with a political, economic and social program that would have support from local national stakeholders, but also by our allies, and above all, by our neighboring countries? In order to do this, we need to think about the whole relationship, the whole system, and we need to have good relationships with neighboring countries. Thank you very much. I can see that we are getting towards the end of our session already, so we would now move on to your questions. So your questions for our panelists. Could we take maybe 2 or 3 questions each time you go out, and then we'll have our answers to these 2 or 3 questions.
So the interpreter apologizes. The question started without a microphone. So the countries we are talking about, do they wish to see a democracy in the way that we see it in France? For example, Egypt or others? And I am thinking about the US. And the view is often that it is the US have created a bit of a mess, if I may say it as such. Another comment. I'm speaking on behalf of an association we have created in Normandy. It is called the Friends of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, created in 2012. I wanted to mention something that happened 2 days ago. Last weekend, I was in Tunisia, and I met with 84 civil societies associations, with young people associations, with the Solidarité Laïque movement in Tunisia, aiming to tackle inequality, to fight for gender equality and for democracy. It was impressive to see 84 associations coming together from all parts of Tunisia, different regions, even rural areas, to come together and look for ways to make progress. It was not the state, it was civil society willing to come together to make progress towards democracy. And you mentioned in democracies, Western democracies, how do we feel about it? Because we are in Caen, here in Normandy, when we created our Friends of Arab Spring, Friends of Tunisia association, we wanted to support with what we can do. We felt if we do not help in creating democracy, there it's important to establish positive relationships between countries. And we feel this may actually play against us in the long run. I understand you called it Arab Spring. It was not the most appropriate term, but we have kept the name, although we are aware of the paradoxical aspect. This is what it was called at the start, and we're still in the process, I understand, and I agree with that. I just wanted to add one thing. In our association, we try each year to organize travel between people from Normandy and people from Tunisia going to each other's countries and areas. And it is not easy. It is not easy. French people going to Tunisia is so much more, so much easier than Tunisian youth coming here. It is such disregard for young people for people in southern countries here. And I wanted to mention that in 2017, here in this very room, an event took place with 10 women from CAFSA who were preparing to be candidates in municipal elections, the first municipal elections in 2018. And these women wanted to meet with women officials here to talk about their fight, men-women equality, gender equality, to also sponsor these questions, these topics in their campaigns. I think it's important because here this is a debate about the Arab world and Arab countries. It's important to not just think about what governments and states can do for their country, but also the civil society is doing a lot. Civil society associations. And thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, that is a very positive message. We can take a third question before we go on and answer them. The 2011 uprisings have played a great role, I think, also they have brought our attention onto these issues. I think after the first uprisings, we have seen also certain uprisings for example, in Greece, the Syriza movement and the Indignados in Spain, and in France, Gilets jaunes. This is more recent, of course, probably cannot be linked. But I wanted to say that really it has sparked our interest in Europe. That is why I liked our friend from Beirut. You said sometimes you may think we look at other countries thinking, oh, they are in a much worse situation than we are. But it is sparking interest. It is bringing our attention onto these topics. I am thinking about everything you said, Mr. Abdel Samad, Mr. Kherari, His Excellency. We have talked about here in France solidarity associations, I think it's also an interesting aspect. The friendship, the links we can find with European movements. So first question, do Egyptians want democracy? Professor Filiou. I think Egyptians are no different to other human beings here on Earth. I don't think we can say any citizen on this planet is satisfied with a president with 98% votes in an election. We know that when arbitrary decisions are made, people are not happy, and we return to the status quo. What about the United States? You asked about the ways in the US. I'm not a fan. We have to admit that a lot of strategic mistakes have been made, and we keep seeing mistakes being made in the region. It sounds like a Machiavellian plan to divide. It is true, they have created a mess, and we have paid the price. In Europe, we have paid the price. But the ultimate price is being paid by the men and women in the region. I would like to really congratulate you, the person who told us about the association, the second question or comment. It is so important to see that despite petitions we may sign, talks we may try to organize between leaders, we have to keep in mind that no movement is unseen, no movement is too small. The fact that people get together, want to show they are interested, they are supportive, that is absolutely important, that is crucial. That is, we can say, in Yemen, for example, the dual crime, the crime being committed, and the silence, the deafening silence of the international community. And I am thinking about the bombing in Aleppo. I know when the militia were looking at me, I thought they would tell me off. And the only thing they said to me is Russians are supporting their friends. Interesting. And Ziad Abdel-Samad, I thought you may want to react to the French Association and the NGOs meeting between France and Tunisia. What about your NGO, your network of NGOs? Are you expecting, hoping for support and help from French and European players? Of course, European civil society is very active and has a very important role with direct activities and direct support in Arab countries. Some countries are quite closed, but there are a number of countries where European civil society is very active and they play an important role. So whether it is about socio-economic matters or political matters, there are a lot of partnerships. For example, we are part of a Euro-Mediterranean network, and we often are in touch with European member states and NGOs and associations. European civil society plays a role not just to support the fight in Arab countries, but also in Europe. Because the leaders, European leaders in European member states, they always have to be reminded of the role they need to play. And unfortunately, if we look at political players now, the efficiency efficacy of European governments' leaders is very small. They play a very small role compared to other societies. So we have to push and encourage European leaders to actually play their role. This is what Europe was built on the values of democracy, the values of human rights. That is why Europeans are expected to play this role, to uphold human rights, to uphold these values, to make sure they are respected. That is why I'm encouraging leaders and civil societies in Europe to step forward. And I'm thinking about the diaspora from Arab countries. They also have a very important role to play financially, politically, wherever they are. Thank you, Mr. Herrari. We heard a comment about social justice. And of course, we feel in all countries in the world, but also in Arab countries, the need for social justice. Why? Of course, it is essential. In fact, it is the unique cause. Citizens wanted to stand up and be counted. They wanted to demand better wealth distribution. They demanded to be heard. So the power is not just in the hands of the army or not just in the hands of a few representatives of a political party, but I believe the question was also about inter-civil societies solidarity. And I can talk about Tunisia. And I have seen such illustrations because it is a long tradition, an old tradition. For example, we have GTT, Central Union in Tunisia, which contributed to the fight for independence. So this is, I talked about the singularity, uniqueness in Tunisia. It is because we have a strong social fabric. These unions, these workers' unions, has strong links with workers' unions in France, in Europe, as well as the leaders, corporate leaders' unions also have very strong links. So the award was given to the quartet to acknowledge these relations. Tunisia is a strong player in the World Social Forum for all associations. Internationally, we play a very strong role. I wanted to underline and reply the second comment. It is very important for associations to be involved. It is very important for members in the countries involved to remember the role that they can play as associations and as voters. Because in these countries, we have to keep in mind that we can look for support and understanding to convey certain political views or to build a better future. I'm sorry, I'm going to probably leave in a few minutes because I will have to catch a train. But I will just make a last comment, which will be a link between the three comments we heard. In our region, there is one question. I am always touched to hear optimism. If there is a possibility to do something about education. I remain hopeful if we can do something on education, on demographics, and the status of women. I think if we can do something about these three topics, then we can give space to citizens. We can create citizens in their full right. To create an inclusive society, we have to balance demographics. Of course, we have to educate, and as long as women are not considered as equal, men and women are not considered as equal, we will not be able to create the conditions for citizenship. Women represent 50% of society and often more, often over 50%. And so that is obvious to all that women also need to be able to live in their full right. So these are the three conditions, I believe, the three prerequisites for citizenship. It was a pleasure to be with you today. And if I do not take this train, unfortunately, I will be staying here, which was not organized, which was not planned for. I would unfortunately have to go and catch my train, but it was an honor and a privilege to be with you today. Thank you. We will take a few more questions, as we still have 10 minutes. If we can please bring a microphone. I have a question. It may sound a bit simple. It is related to what Mr. Ziad Abdel Samad said earlier. That resonated with me. You said you do not understand how Western democracies and Europe especially could compromise with regimes, with certain regimes that are oppressing their people. What can we expect? Can we expect certain measures, certain embargoes, certain military measures, governmental measures? One more question?
Following the Tunisian revolution of 2011, we saw the emergence of new political parties, including Islamist parties. We've not spoken much about such parties at the moment. And when you look at the results of elections from 2011 up to now, they are beginning to lose the number of votes that they normally get. So this situation is quite unique at the moment in Tunisia, where the prime minister is being led out of office, and difficult situation with the National Assembly as well. So it's a new phase of the Tunisian resolution, I would say. I don't know if you'd agree. And there's the Muslim Brothers, this with Turkey on one side, Saudi Arabia on one side, and we've got Iran and its allies. So it's a struggle for leadership in the Arab world, really. So what influence do these external powers have on the revolution? It's not just a local issue. You can feel that behind all of this is an ideological war that's ongoing as well. Maybe one last question. No, there's no more questions. Okay. Great. Well, then I'll let Ziad Abdel Samad answer this question. The question we just heard about when you're asking support from the EU or European countries. Is it more political support, diplomatic support? Not military support, no.
Et je ne crois pas à la force ni aux interventions
I don't believe in military strength or military interventions, except for in some quite exceptional situations. But I hope we won't get there in our countries. So what I meant, really,
initiatives politiques
is that European political initiatives should be more targeted, and Europe's political and diplomatic role should be more better directed and more efficient. And secondly, international law should be applied simply. These international treaties are not being respected. They're supporting systems and regimes that do not respect international law and international resolutions. So thirdly, you should implement targeted sanctions, not just blind sanctions against a whole country, but targeted sanctions. And I note in my country, in Lebanon, when Europe started to think of targeted sanctions on certain politicians, we saw how they changed. Their attitudes changed. These targeted sanctions scared them. I think the European Court of Justice could take measures as well in this respect. So there's many different things that Europe could do. But the most important thing is political decisions. Thank you very much. Now over to Jean-Pierre Filiou to answer the last question and let him conclude as well. Myself and Jean-Pierre Filiou will also be signing our books if any of you are interested just after this session. That's it for me. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to conclude. I'll try to be hopeful. Yes, sir. We do have regional predators who are filling the abyss, filling the gap. But you're being nice to them when you say that they have an ideology. What's the ideology of Putin? What's the ideology of the UAE? They're just all about business and shutting up dissidents. People say that it's a big play, a global stage between opposing powers, but this is not the case. However, to come back to Europe now, if Europe does not fill this void, the void that's been left by the Americans, because the Americans' withdrawal is irreversible, and the Americans' withdrawal was pronounced the day when Trump welcomed Netanyahu to Washington, and he said, "I'm going to make the deal of the century." And there were no Arabs in the whole world. There was maybe 3 ambassadors in the room at the end, but the sub-prefect of Ramallah of the leader of the Palestinian Authority saying that he wasn't going to the room. This led to these issues with the deal of the century. So for Europe in general, and for France, with the presidency of the EU institutions, there's now an open road. We now need to be coherent with our values. We need to stop giving the Legion of Honor to criminals who have blood on their hands, and for once and for all, we need to understand that we need to use our strength, not just military strength, but also strength in terms of rules and regulations and in terms of our values, coherence. And when we are coherent in defending our values, then inevitably and very quickly we will have results in terms of the policy that we implement. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for listening, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.